Hey guys, welcome back to part three of our study of the progressive movement here in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Before we get started, my always helpful assistant has decided she wanted to show us our hashtag, and if you'll bring that on over here, McKate, she put her own little flair to it as well with A Push Some Reforms. Go for it, kids. And of course, from her digital learning days, she's learned something important, some knowledge she wishes to impart to you as well.
Study hard, peeps.
And there's my daughter, Emma Kate Martin, future YouTube star. You heard it here first. All right, picking up from where we left off with the muckrakers. Remember, these are people that are trying to rake up the muck and the filth of society so that their readers could be shocked and angered enough to push the government to take action. You're looking at the people like Ida Tarbell that wrote about the Standard Oil Company, Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, and Lincoln Steffens that wrote The Shame of the Cities, and also wrote a little bit as well about some other topics. But these are some of your three biggest progressive writers. And again, they're writing in book form, but they're also writing articles as well from some of those muckraking publications that we talked about. Now that we know kind of the roots of the progressive movement and who some of those famous progressives are, both on the city level, the state level, and if you think about Teddy Roosevelt, if you think about William Jennings Bryan, tier, you'll realize that progressives were at every level of this country, state, local, federal, national. Let's talk about some of their accomplishments and some of the things that they wanted to do. And we won't cover the entire thing in this video. The rest will be what you'll read and we'll talk about tomorrow. And by the way, I'm going to try to set up a Zoom conference tomorrow evening to where we can sit down and talk, and maybe in a live chat format that we'll be able to sit down and we can talk about some of these issues. You can jump in and share some of your questions and some of your concerns that you may have. Let's look, first of all, at some of the reforms that went on in the states and in the cities themselves as we go through this progressive era. Really, the cornerstone of progressive ideology is they have a faith in democracy. They really do believe that if you put good people up for office and if you reform, people generally will want to vote for the honest, most reliable, most efficient candidate, such as the ones we talked about with the factory system where they run things very efficiently on the basis of scientific management. It was believed the majority of voters would elect these honest officials, and how they would go about doing that is very different. In the old days, the machines would print out a list of their candidates, watch you vote at the polling place, and watch you drop into the ballot box. So they would know how you voted. So the reformers of these times said, let's just change that up. Let's stop the power of the political machine, and let's make it to where people can vote in secret. And there was already a form out there called the Australian ballot that had been done in, wait for it, Australia, where you could go into a booth, punch out the names of the folks you wanted to vote for or somehow note those names and then drop it in a secret ballot box. So no one knew how you voted. So that was one way that it was a huge improvement over the traditional ways we voted, and it was a way to clip the wings a little bit of the bosses in the Tammany Halls and in the other big cities other than New York. Bob La Follette, if you will talk a little bit more about him, he's the reform-minded governor of Wisconsin. He took something called the direct primary. In the past, a lot of political candidates were chosen at meetings that were dominated by the party. So the Democratic Party in the cities, the Republican Party elsewhere, they would pick the candidates they wanted to run for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general of the state, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, what La Follette pioneered in Wisconsin was the idea of the direct primary, where the people themselves would be able to vote on who they wanted to be their candidate to represent them in the general election. What's going on in American politics today here in the 2020 presidential election? You're having primaries. Today, there were three primaries, one in Arizona, one in Illinois, and one in Florida, where Democratic voters in each of those states are deciding directly who they want to represent them to run against President Trump in the general election in November. And in these primaries, they're voting either for former Vice President Joe Biden or current Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. This is, again, we talk about why do we need to know history? Well, the elections we're having right now are a direct result of things that the progressives put into place. So it's not any smoky back rooms anymore that are deciding who the candidates are going to be. It's the people making their own decisions. If you look at number 5 under that political reforms in cities and states, in the old days as well, United States senators, very powerful group. Remember, at this point, there's less than 100 of them in America. Hawaii and Alaska have not been added as states yet. So you have a very small group of extremely powerful, extremely wealthy individuals. They are almost always picked by the party ahead of time, or excuse me, a better yet way to describe it, the legislature that was dominated by a particular party. So in Georgia, during this time period, the Democratic Party dominated Georgia politics. And so the state legislature, which was Democratic controlled, picked who they wanted to be their senator. So the state picked them instead of the people. Well, basically what will come around is the 17th Amendment, which will lead to direct election of United States senators. So instead of having an election where we just vote for our state legislature and then they pick the senators for us, an indirect way of doing things, we decided we're going to put the vote in the people's hands, and the people themselves will go out and vote for who they believe is the best candidate, be it Democrat or Republican. Despite all these successes, the 17th Amendment of the Constitution is huge. I know we skipped the 16th. We're going to come back to that shortly. But the 17th Amendment is huge. The Australian ballot is huge. The direct primary is huge. You would think the progressives were kind of an unstoppable juggernaut. There was however, some limitations there. Even in a direct primary, the political machines found ways to put their guys into position to win. So even though the progressives were able to cut back on some of the power, the political machine still found a way to make sure their candidate appeared on the ballot, and then enough people would go out and vote for them, even if it was a secret ballot. In the South, they just simply continued to repress the votes of Black Americans, so they really never had that chance to go into the secret ballot, the Australian ballot, or participate in the direct primary or the direct election of United States senators. In the end, I think you can say the positives outweighed the negatives, but again, there are some limits to what the progressives were able to accomplish on the state, federal, and national level. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we leave, one of the things we can also talk about is something that's still out there today. There are three ballot things, I guess you would call them, or three reforms that they put on state levels. And one of the things they did was simply something called the initiative. If enough voters in a state decided that they want their legislature to talk about something, to eventually vote on something, they can do what's called the initiative. They can compel their legislatures to actually discuss it. They'll get enough petitions. If they get enough petition signings, the state legislature, such as Georgia, must then take this up as an option, debate it, discuss it, and eventually vote on it. Now, does that mean that the actual thing the people want will get passed? No, but it will compel the legislature to actually talk about it, for instance, here in Georgia. Another one you'll see a lot of is the referendum. That's where you put a ballot initiative directly on the ballot for people to vote for. So, for instance, in Georgia, years ago when they wanted to implement the state lottery, they simply took and put it on the ballot for people to vote for and said, are you in favor or not of adopting a state lottery to help pay for college scholarships, such as those Hope and Zell Miller scholarships that you're all trying to earn here for college. And so the people in a referendum decided that they wanted to have a state lottery here in Georgia. That is a relic of the progressive time period. There will occasionally be ones when you go today into the ballot box or the voting booth, I should say, and say, do you feel like the state of Georgia should do X, Y, and Z? That's the referendum. That's the state asking you as a voter what you think should be done. The last one is the recall, and the recall is rarely used today in American politics. Probably the most important one recently in the last 15 years was in California, where the people of California actually recalled their governor. Now, when we mean recall, we don't mean they hung up on him and called him back. What we mean by the recall is they said, should we pull this person out of a position of power? In California, they had a governor named Gray Davis, who a lot of the citizens were unhappy with, and so they had a recall effort, and they put it on the ballot, should Governor Davis step down and be removed from office? And the majority of the voters voted yes, and so he was forced to step down. That was a way to recall a public official who they believed was either corrupt or incompetent. And again, that's another reform that the progressives put in. We still have that today. If we feel like our politicians are not doing their job before they're up for re-election again, we have the potential to recall them and remove them from office ahead of time. One side note of that is that when Gray Davis was removed from office, the person that took his place was none other than the Terminator himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who became known as the Governator. And with that really, really interesting part of California history, we will pause and I'll come back and give you your assignment to look over for tonight so we can talk about it for our live stream tomorrow evening.